Well, really welcome then. Hi, I'm Craig Call. I'm the Executive Director of the Utah Land Use Institute. Welcome those of you that are here and the dozens that are online and participating in this. We appreciate your being involved in our first of a series of seminars. I just want to mention before we start that the Utah Land Use Institute appreciates the funding that covers the cost of the preparation materials and the presentations. Part of the money comes from the Division of Housing and Community Development of the Department of Workforce Services and their effort to promote moderate income housing and to make development easier. They're funding this program today, along with the Office of the Property Rights Ombudsman. They provide funding for land use training from the 1% fee that is attached to each building permit that someone buys. And this is an example of how that money is being wisely used. Those in the room may receive attorney credit for attending. AICP credit may also be available either online or in the room, but there is no online credit for any profession. But we do appreciate everyone's involvement and hope you'll enjoy it. We appreciate John Jansen taking the lead here, and I will simply turn the time over to him.
Thank you, Craig. Let's go one slide. Thank you all for being here and braving some fun weather. How many came from Salt Lake? Let's see. Just me. Oh no. It's kind of fun. We had like a foot of snow down there in the valley, so interesting kind of day. We're going to talk about transfer development rights. We're going to talk about conservation easements and land trusts, how they all work together, and a few other techniques, generally looking at the topic of community character. Okay, how do we preserve that community character? We've got 5 folks that have joined us here today to talk about these topics. Mayor Larry Jacobson is here. Yes, Larry and I are from Scandinavia, I think. Is that correct?
Yeah, sure.
Tim Watkins, right in the middle, gonna make sure this thing doesn't fall apart, right? And appreciate that. He's Cache County Planning Manager. Levi Roberts works with the mayor in Nibley City. He's the city planner. Online, we have Wendy Fisher, who is down in Sandy, and they may have had a foot and a half, actually. So she didn't make it up here. And that's me, sometimes moderator, sometimes participator, and sometimes here, okay? I just like this picture because that's the name I grew up with, JJ, okay? And this is from Idaho, a little place called Kelly Canyon. Anybody ever skied there? Ever heard of that one? Fun little place. Okay, I'm going to turn this over to Larry to start things off.
Thanks, Jan. You can Jan Janssen or something like that. I could be Jakobsen if that's the way it goes. Okay, so let me cut to the chase. Are we tired of winning yet? I was in a group about this size, 40 mayors from around the state about 6 months ago, and we were talking about growth. And the conversation quickly turned into what I think was a gripe session. It was one mayor trying to out-complain another mayor about how terrible the impacts of growth were having on their cities. And to try to refocus the conversation, I stood up and asked the mayors, I said, are we tired of winning yet? Because this is what success looks like. We didn't get to this place of the fastest growing state in the nation or overwhelming economic success because it just happened. This is in fact what we have been trying to achieve, I think, since the pioneers arrived in what would become the state of Utah. And in fact, if we look at Utah's tagline, my day job, I'm an engineer, but I realize the importance of a good tagline. What are we? We're the beehive state. We're industrious. We have a work ethic. We work hard. We build things. In fact, if you look at the beehive, our state icon, can you think of anything that comes closer to multifamily, high-density attached housing than the beehive? So, as I talk to people in Nibley, I write down what problems they expect me to solve. I want to share those with you. Number one, we need to conserve open space. Number two, we need to preserve our rural heritage. Number three, we need to provide attainable housing, especially for our kids who want to live close to us. We need to provide life cycle housing for young people that may not be in love with the idea of caring for a half-acre landscape. And we need to help old people like me that don't want to keep up with that landscaping demand either. But most importantly, we need to not raise taxes, and we need to not allegedly devalue my property by letting too many people come into our community. If all that sounds impossible, then fear not, because these experts, present company excluded, they have secret weapons that will all make you superheroes. Ways to help preserve the community character that we have come to expect in the communities that we live in. So with that, we'll talk about a set of tools, and we'll turn it back over to John to introduce us. I want to introduce myself, actually. If you get to be a skier, I want to tell you about my most important job in Nibley City. I am a Little League umpire, because I just don't have enough people yelling at me yet.
Thank you, Mayor. Appreciate that. If you all want to add something about yourselves, feel free. Nope, we're good? We're good?
I'm good.
Okay. All right. All right, we need to push a couple buttons there, like two. There we go. Okay, so generally speaking, what we're going to try and do this afternoon, and I'm going to stay close to the owl, is talk about transfer development rights, okay, affectionately called TDR, conservation easements as part of land trust philosophies, okay. Other tools that we'll get to are the purchase of development rights, overlays, okay, zoning type overlays to help with community character, cluster zoning. You all may have heard of that before, and we're going to get into that a little bit, and Tim especially. And then the idea of flexible agricultural zones. We're going to talk about all of those. So let's go on. So TDR, how many have heard of that before? Okay, wow. It's an educated group. But it's been around a long time, a very long time. Let's see. Yeah, lose my train of thought. The folks outside. Grand Central Station, ever heard of that? New York. Kind of a neat place. Originally was privately owned, and the owner wanted to build over it. City worked out a deal with them to sell the development rights from what could be built over to another building nearby, okay? Long time ago. That building is still there. Now it's publicly owned by the Transportation Agency. But across the country, we've seen a lot of programs that have started up and been very successful. We're going to look at a couple of those real quick today. We've got TDR programs in our state that have been very successful, and some that were not. And we'll discuss why not on that. And I can say the city I worked for 30 years, we had a program and it did not work. So, but I'll tell you why in a little bit. Okay, thank you. So here's the idea, right, is that you're selling theoretical development rights from the open space, the agricultural land, the orchard, whatever it might be that you want to preserve, and moving it to another place in your community, a place where you all agree. And how's that go? You all agree that density, which, in planning, that's the D word, right? I mean, in our personal lives, it's something else, but the D word in planning is density, okay? It's always the toughest thing to talk about, But you're talking about moving development rights, theoretical ones, from the open space, from the ag land, whatever it might be, over into a place where, as a community, you agree that more density makes sense, which of course is already in your general plans, right? Okay, let's do the next one. And it's pretty much the same philosophy, just a different graphic for you. So we'll go on. Credits are sold. I want to make sure that you understand those are theoretical credits, right? So if right now the zoning for an agricultural piece is 1 unit for 10 acres, it's not just the 1 unit you're talking about. This is theoretical units that become kind of a currency that a farmer or an open space person gets to sell, okay? So those are transferred from that open space, from that ag land to another place in your community. The jargon from a TDR is sending areas, okay? Sending being the places you want to preserve, and receiving areas being the places where you push that density. In a sense, this is like following your general plan, right? You've already said in your plan, these are good spots where we could have some density. Everybody's got that in their plan, right? Of course, I'm not seeing a lot of head nods, but okay. Usually, you'll have some places that make sense. Near Maine, near a highway, near some other town, whatever it might be. But you have to figure out some place where that density could go. Let's go on. Maybe. Okay. The theory of this is that there's enough development rights, which we'll call credits, okay, for the farmer. Just use the farmer for a while. Enough development rights that that person could sell to a developer that they feel like they could either let go of their property or establish a permanent conservation easement on it. They feel like they've gotten the value that they want. One piece of that that's important to remember is they still get to do what they've been doing on that property, okay? So, okay.
If you keep moving, John, so those of us on this side can...
I like to move around, actually, so we'll irritate this side now. Okay. So if you have an orchard, could you still pick peaches for years and years and years to come? Yes, you could. You have an alfalfa field. Could you keep doing that? Yes. If you had an open space that you weren't doing much with, that still can continue too. So there's lots of value that's still left, but you've sold off that development potential, okay, which again is theoretical, all right? I like to call it a currency, all right? And it's a property right you don't have right now, all right? People think of it as a new property right that's established by the city putting together, or the county putting together, an ordinance that enables all that to happen. Okay, and the market part I think is important to understand too, and you're going to see the word voluntary in here a lot of times, okay? Because you have to have a developer that's willing to pay the farmer, right, for those potential development credits, which that developer will take to the receiving area, take to where he's got some other property where he can get some more density. You got to have that. If there's no market, this system doesn't work. So, okay. Try to give you an example. So let's do some math together. How's that? You got a 10-acre piece, all right? Right now it has 1 unit per acre. Sorry, 1 unit per 10 acres. That's your alfalfa field. Through this enabling ordinance, you're allowed to have 3 units per acre. Okay, so that's going to be 30 units to sell, right? What's the price for those units? Well, that's going to be established by a negotiation between the developer and the property owner, okay? We might get some general ideas of what they might go for in part of this process of adopting an ordinance, but it's still that negotiation between that developer and that property owner, okay? If it's $5,000, that's one thing. If it's $30,000 per credit, that's another, okay? But the object for the property owner, the farmer, is to get enough that he or she feels comfortable with establishing a conservation easement that is permanent on the property, okay? And that density moving away. Okay, yeah, so just quickly, the hurdles that we see in most of the communities, I've been involved in 3 or 4 of these so far. Height in the it's really almost all about the receiving area, okay? The height, okay, in that receiving area, the density in there, what are you willing to do, what kind of housing types? That's a design, I think a few TDR systems in Utah, they didn't have any real design criteria for the receiving area, so you get what people like to call barracks a lot, instead of something that's a nice product for folks to live in. So that's an important aspect of it too. And one I keep bringing up, and I know Wendy will bring this up too, but when you think about permanent open space, there are management issues with a permanent open space. So there's got to be some kind of funding that could happen initially in the transactions or later on, but there has to be some kind of funding to watch over the property on a permanent basis. Let's go on. Here's the other one that this is where West Valley City failed, okay? We set up a system along a canal area that had a lot of wetlands near it, and wanted to preserve that as a trail, open space in the community, and set up a TDR system, went to the council meeting for adoption, had a nice recommendation from the planning commission. Council said, well, that's nice, but we want to still be able to rezone in other places for higher density. This theory here is you're not really going to rezone in your receiving area, okay? You're going to use TDR to increase density, but you're not just going to give them a new zoning district where they don't need TDR, okay? Follow that theory? So I'm calling that zoning discipline. The idea being that if a developer can get the density that he, she, they want, TDR is not going to work unless you're saying, hey, to get that density, you've got to go and negotiate with the open space owner, the farmer, whatever it might be. Okay? Yep.
I have a question. So you're talking about like a density bonus that is over and above what's normally allowed in that zone?
Could be. Yeah, I think that's a good way to put it, actually. Yes. Whatever density you bring from TDR, you get to apply that to that zone in the receiving area, okay? Bonus, you still have to go buy something, so I don't know. It's just an interesting piece of it, but you need to bring that in to make that development happen, okay? Does that make sense?
I still don't quite, I used to be on the zoning commission, so like if you've got something that's zoned that can allow, 20 units per acre, it's already zoned that.
Mm-hmm.
And you're bringing a TDR that, how are you gonna get more than 20 units per acre unless they zone that and say, if you meet certain criteria, you can have a bonus and have 40 units per acre? Or, how does that work with what's already zoned there?
Yeah, so obviously they have the right to do what is already zoned, the 20 units, okay? And I might make an argument that you probably don't want a zone like that to be your receiving area because they can probably make profit on 20 units per acre, okay? But if you had something at 10 or 5 and you wanted to increase that and you think it's a good spot, the only way they get to do that is with the TDR credits, okay? So they get to bring them in.
But they only get to do it if the city changes the zoning, right?
It's not a changing of zoning. So I think this one comes up here in a second. Yes, actually it's the next thing. So what really makes this work is if the developer has an assurance that if he brings the TDR credits to the property, he gets to build his project, okay? It's not iffy. It's not a negotiation with city council or planning commission. It's, you do this, you get that.
But if he wants to go to 20 units per acre like she's asking and it's now zoned for 10, isn't that going to require a zoning change by the city?
So the actual TDR ordinance will allow that to happen,
So
okay?
it's a city zoning ordinance that's in place already.
Yeah, we need, okay, we can try to do that.
Oh, that's
Let me paraphrase, how's that? Yeah, sorry, we can't all hear that. So the question is, what happens in that receiving zone? You have 20 units per acre or 10 or whatever it is, how does that get added on? That's part of that enabling ordinance that you're doing with the TDR, okay? You get to push that density up if you bring the TDR, okay? Yep.
So does the TDR ordinance state, like,
Brendan, you're gonna have to yell. I don't know if I, yeah, it might make it. There we go.
so does the TDR ordinance state something to the effect of, in such and such zones that have been designated as receiving zones, upon the sale of TDR credits, that you can do up to X units from the base amount per acre?
Essentially, yes, you may have a max on it, you may not.
Okay.
But that is part of that ordinance, and the underlying zones are there, but the TDR itself, it has a map associated with it, showing you the sending areas, the areas you want to preserve, and the receiving areas, okay? So it's essentially an overlay over your other zones. Okay, I'm gonna quote from this book, because I think this is a really important point. There's actually an interesting update of the book that we have at the end as one of the sources you might want to look at. If zoning certainty can be obtained through credits, that's our TDR credits, it can counterbalance the additional costs with less time and risk. Anybody a developer in the room today? Maybe online, who knows? What's that? Occasionally?
No, it's a problem. They need to be in on these kind of discussions.
Okay.
And they aren't.
Actually, in the handout that you're going to get, maybe an electronic copy, we do talk about the idea of meeting with folks in the sending areas and potential developers. Okay, it makes sense because this is an educational thing, right? I mean, not everybody understands all this stuff. So the point of this being that for developers, a lot of times time is a big issue. Okay, they've got a loan they're paying on, whatever it might be. Materials and everything start going up in price. Time is money to them. So if you can shorten that amount of time for them, sometimes that is helpful. Okay, let's go on. Okay, bringing it back home here. Mapleton, one of the communities in Utah that actually started their program in 1998, and they've been able to preserve 750 acres. How many acres in a square mile? Oh, 640. There we go. Over a square mile that they've preserved through TDR, okay? On a bench, where a place that the city really wanted to get trails and open space to stick around. I think it might even be the Bonneville bench, but yes.
So is that, to be able to, for them to want that then, it really is not gonna stay in farm ground. Okay. It's gonna go into some kind of a set-aside trails and things like that, is that?
Okay, so,
I come
yes.
from a farmer's side, I just came from a farm bureau.
Okay,
So.
Mapleton's-
I'm looking at this saying, how are we gonna, satisfy a farmer if we've got him a piece of ground, but he's surrounded by everything else?
yeah. So in their case, it's an open space, right? And they wanted it for trails, recreation purposes, views, all those kinds of things. And it stays that way, okay? With a farming property, let's hope that some other parcels come in around you, okay, for one. But next, the idea that you're going to be the farmer that lives forever and in perpetuity, right? Well, you're not, but that's part of that management and stewardship responsibility that the conservation easement holder has, okay? They have to find another farmer in 30 years to do that, those kinds of things. Or it may become an open space and have some other purposes, okay?
Yeah, because farmers, we're having trouble with that because we realize the next generation probably doesn't want to farm it.
Yeah. You know,
Unless you have equipment to farm a little piece.
yeah.
And because our farming operation really is way over here.
Yeah, when we get to Wendy, she'll talk about larger parcels. I think there is some better ways when they're larger, but smaller parcels, you know, there may be a question whether 10 acres is just too small, okay? 20, maybe too small. The community can go through that and decide. Yeah.
Just repeat the comment if you could.
Okay, so that one was about farming. Hopefully we got that. Another question over here? Yep. Maybe.
I too am on the farming side. So I'm sitting here saying, okay, 750 acres have been preserved, but what was the impact on the receiving side? I'm like Jack, it's like the receiving municipality has to have a zone or something, but you're saying that's bought in on the TDR. So I'm saying we also have to study the impact as far as density that some municipality wasn't ready for, or were they ready for, or how do they absorb that into their municipal or the county, whoever is in that receiving area? Does that make sense?
Yep, sure. So that's part of the process, okay? It's going. Part of the process. You have to be comfortable where the receiving areas are and have those make sense for your community. Mapleton, they spread it out a little bit. So if you had a 10,000 square foot lot zone, you might be able to get down to 8,000 square foot, okay, with TDRs. But they spread it out on the community, plus they had nodes where they could actually densify quite a bit. But you're bringing up the question, which is, where do you put that density? That ought to be a discussion you have in your general plan, okay? And you can just look at logical places for that. But your general plan ought to be something that supports this also, right?
Well, on top of that, we talk about ADUs. Some municipalities call me and say, I don't want an ADU because that's in my annexation path. And so here in the county, you have many different communities who have different zoning and everything else. So that part of the receiving becomes the important part to me.
Okay, and yeah, so the decisions on where to put that density, I tried to say that earlier, that's one of the big issues, okay? And, you know, no matter where you think you're gonna end up, you're gonna have community members that probably don't agree, right? So it's just the way that is. So the ADU part, I'm not quite sure I followed, but
It's another discussion.
okay, all right. Assuming that's a detached ADU.
Or not.
Okay. We'll actually, I'll do a plug for Craig's program, which is they're going to have a seminar on ADUs also. So, okay, next. Let's see, where are we? Oh, let me just finish. Just across the hill, okay. Yeah, I think it's, I don't know which direction it is. Sorry, south. South. They have a system there where some transfers have been done up into the ski resorts, okay? Trying to keep that Ogden Valley as pristine as possible. And if you haven't been over the hill lately, it's not that pristine anymore. So, anyway, Spanish Fork's working on that. They have some river bottoms they want to preserve. Nibley City, Levi will talk about that in a few minutes, is also underway with a TDR program. Let's go. I pretty much touched on that, but that's some more detail. And in this handout, we actually have case studies for you to take a look at for 3 communities in Utah, and Mapleton's one of them. So you can look at the detail there. Okay, move on. Oh, and if you go to the Spanish Forks website and you want an interesting video, really nicely done video that they've got for promoting, discussing, educating people on TDR. So we'll just go on. Okay, just do a quick little intro and then it's Tim's turn. I said across the country, we've had a lot of big systems that actually been put together over the years. In a little state in the United States called New Jersey, they have a fairly large wetland area that they tried to preserve and were successful in starting that with TDR and ended up becoming, I believe, a national park, actually. So one thing to think about here is, and we're going to try and get into this today, that probably no one tool is going to solve all of the community character, rural heritage issues that you've got and that you want to deal with, okay? Multiple tools make sense. This one in New Jersey started off as TDR and ended up as a national park kind of a thing. Larimer County was another one. And part of the point of this is that county systems have worked fairly well across the United States. And on that note, Tim's going to talk about some ideas there. There you go.
Well, thank you, John. Great introduction to TDR. Really nice forum that you've created here. So thank you, and Greg, Land Use Institute, and everyone that's participated. And we're happy to host here at Cache County. So thank you all for joining us. I'd like to share a little context, acknowledging that every community is different. Every county and relationship between county and municipality is different throughout our state, throughout other states. But the principles we can learn from the principles that John has been teaching us. And so what I'd like to refer to is the status of the Cache County Comprehensive General Plan update. We're at the final stage of a public review and a county council review of this general plan. There are some other components, a regional collaboration plan and an urban and rural area assessment, cost of services planning scenarios. I'll touch on these a little bit later, but these two appendages to the plan look at how the county can work with partner municipalities and coordinate growth decisions, coordinate and explore what land use compatibility looks like, how to shape growth, and how to achieve an overarching mantra, if you will, came from over a dozen years ago, an Envision Cache Valley process, explored the theme of keeping the country country and cities, understanding that cities, municipalities need to grow. And this draft future land use map for the Comprehensive General Plan update shows a rural, low density agricultural with residential opportunity throughout much of the valley floor, but then anticipating these hatched areas where growth is anticipated to extend outward from municipalities. And the general plan doesn't dictate how that growth will occur by any stretch, but it certainly encourages the regional collaboration and exploration of how that growth should occur and how to coordinate that with the municipalities. These are the principles of the general plan, including this principle of regional collaboration. The principle of heritage and stewardship is that the open and rural nature of the county's unincorporated areas is an important component of community character that should be preserved. And you see the encouragement, the objective to continue to explore new regulatory tools to support development and ag land preservation, such as transfer development rights, purchase development rights. The general plan doesn't have it all figured out, but it invites, I should say the draft general plan, invites further exploration of such tools. And one way to explore is to create some visualizations, and it helps to understand the densities, the target densities of both the sending areas and the receiving areas. And so through the, I call these preliminary studies that could continue forward as additional studies of transferring development rights or clustering development. And so if we look at the context of this lower density throughout the valley floor as the 1 unit per 10 acre density or zoning, it's represented by this grid of a red square representing a development right, and potentially within reasonable proximity of a nearby municipality that's planning to grow outward in this future annexation area. We've seen a trend of property owners in the county unincorporated area seeking more density, sometimes proposing a rezone to 2-acre or 5-acre density. And that's what this change of character looks like, looking at an average of, 3 to 5 acres per lot. And some might argue that there could be some farming, some smaller scale agriculture, but generally less farmable than what the original condition was, and perhaps less farmable than this cluster development depiction, which takes a similar number of units, but rather than allowing for a rezone to a 3 or 5 acre density, allows for the concentration of these lots and homes in a cluster development and leaving the open space for, it could be agriculture, it could be natural areas. And, the density bonus could apply here, that there could be a density bonus that allows for more than 1 unit per 10 acres in these receiving or cluster areas. But that has not been determined. There's not a set formula, but the principles are potentially to be considered in further study. And then I do want to add that these need to be coordinated with the nearby municipalities. Does a cluster development make sense this close to a community? Or is there an established understanding of where the community extents would like to somewhat reach a limit of growth and where the county shaping of development and open space preservation could begin? So this idea is a step between cluster development and transfer development right. You might call this a light transfer development right. And it's the notion that if you have an owner represented by owner A, and it could be more than one owner, it could be ownership group A of 2 or more property owners, and they would like to combine their development rights into one area, but perhaps not all of the parcels are adjacent, but perhaps they're within a reasonable proximity, I don't know, maybe within a half mile or so, that they could cluster/transfer that development into a concentrated area and leave the infrastructure, the road, the development away from areas that might be better left as open space and better left undisturbed. Owner B may not be interested to participate and would not get in the way of these property ownership group A working together to achieve something similar to what you see here, and owner C. So this depicts something that could happen out in the unincorporated area, certainly needing to be careful that the concentration of homes does not overwhelm the septic capacity of the soils, that the relationship between the septic systems on individual wells, septic systems and individual wells, that water quality is, and the availability of water is carefully considered. So that's part of the formula is in the county unincorporated areas, looking at the capacity of the development area. And then this shows if it was near a community, would this be a compatible growth relationship in the county and the municipality, and where does the city want to stop serving growth? Where does it begin in the county? And where should the open space be versus the development? So these are important questions to explore together between county and partner municipalities. And noting that this configuration of development creates fewer road miles and utilities per housing unit compared to this pattern, which would have more extensive roads to take care of, and those can be expensive for especially private roads for private property owners or developments, or public roads serving fewer homes. Okay, and then this last depiction is similar to what John was describing as a sending area in a community, that whether a community such as Nibley wants to annex a large area and preserve open space and farmland within the municipal boundaries, or if a municipality would like to receive development rights from the county unincorporated area, those could be transferred in through an interlocal agreement. And you see a depiction of, on the far right, what might represent 8,000 square foot lots or 10,000. And then you see a mix of smaller lots, single family and townhomes with little homeowners association parks, or it could be public parks, but amenity driven planned unit developments, that density of say 8 to 12 units per acre, well, closer to 8 units per acre, could be achieved by the developers purchasing those development rights. And a few homes remaining in the open space area, in the county unincorporated area. Some development opportunity there, but largely a compatible and appropriate location to continue agricultural or other open space opportunities. The general plan also encourages agritourism and value-added uses to support farming into the future. And certainly we've heard from our the citizens in our partner municipalities that traveling along trail corridors between communities and out into beautiful destinations in the county is something that our citizenry would love, and would love to expand a countywide trail system. And perhaps cluster development and transfer development rights can create incentive for establishing some of those corridors through open space preservation and building on the countywide trails and master plan. So regional collaboration will focus on many topics, including growth and growth shaping, and where open space and where growth and density should occur. But those are conversations that I think are important to coordinate between county and municipality, or one municipality to another. And then I'll just briefly mention one of those attachments or appendices to the general plan is this cost of services. It's really a set of scenarios that explores a 2040 growth projection, population increase of nearly 50,000. And these are not any communities in particular, but it's a diagram to depict different growth patterns. This being the left column, and you see the yellow representing single family dwelling. It's perhaps more of the past 15 years or so of growth projected forward. It consumes land quickly. It has more infrastructure, a higher infrastructure ratio to service homes, as compared to something that's more a cluster development pattern, where you would have open space areas, and those could be prioritized along riparian corridors for, water quality and maybe even recreation. But you see the development footprint is reduced because there's this clustering into a smaller average lot size, more diverse housing types, but more land preserved or not developed and reserved for future development. And then a third scenario is exploring more of what a transferred growth alternative might look like. And again, a smaller development footprint, smaller average single family lot size, more housing diversity, more land preserved, and also more land reserved for future development. So this report looks at the infrastructure efficiency, the cost savings there for maintaining infrastructure over time, and reduced water use. And this is intended as information, not imposing any policy on anyone, but as a reference, and something to consider as we explore partnerships for shaping growth and potentially preserving open space for a variety of purposes.
Yeah, thanks, Tim.
John?
Yep.
We have some questions from online.
Okay, the chat is open.
Okay. So some of the questions in the chat were, do the development rights carry the zoning with them?
So, I think the easiest way to explain that is, again, if we have a agricultural piece that has 1 unit for 20 acres, that's the zoning that you have now, right? With this, you get some additional units that are theoretical units to sell, okay, to move off that parcel. I'm not totally sure that's answering that question, but strikes me as, yeah, you still keep that zoning that you've had on the preservation parcel, and there's zoning in the receiving area too. But this adds to it in the receiving area, okay?
Another question is, if farmland isn't preserved and rights are not yet transferred, yet there is still demand for more units, is there a risk that previous farmland converts to sprawled or suburban development?
I think that's the winning question, right? Yeah, I think part of the discussion here really is that you can look at all kinds of areas in Salt Lake Valley that, you know, at one time were all farms, right? And now they're all subdivisions, or maybe some commercial thrown in here and there. But it's, you know, it does get absorbed because we have so much growth occurring. A lot of it is our own, and then we have a lot of in-migration too. So there's demand for those agricultural parcels to develop. I know when we've spoken to farmer groups in the past, one of the things that really hit home for me was, you know, selling my farm property is my retirement plan, okay? And I think that's reality, right? Your property's gone up. I mean, everybody's property's gone up recently, right? But it's gone up in value a lot in the last 20, 30, 40 years. And if you sell it and someone can develop it, certainly there's parcels, and I'm glad you brought up the septic tank thing. There's parcels that really can't develop very much because they have no access to infrastructure, to utilities. But they could sell development rights, theoretical ones, and really still retain the use of that property and gain some financial gain. So.
Thank you. I think this is more for Tim, but before you get to the audience questions. This person said, I would be interested to know how much a municipality could save in utilities, services like trash, mail, etc., and road maintenance while serving the same number of units as a more typical suburban style dwelling pattern.
I don't have numbers ready to share as a typical savings when you drop from a certain density down to or from a lower density up to a higher density. It can be substantial. There's the initial cost of buying the infrastructure with a home. That the size of my lot dictates how much sewer and water pipe and curb gutter and asphalt I'm purchasing. So the less frontage or smaller my lot, theoretically the less infrastructure I'm buying, and therefore less cost to the home. But then there is the life cycle cost of the infrastructure, and that is the inspection of the pipes and the maintenance of those and the maintenance of the roads and so forth. So I think that's what the cost of services appendix to the general plan aims to provide as a reference, and there are some figures in there that I'd be happy to share that link as some of those figures are available. And the intent is to have that modeling available to partner communities to explore a more specific area and explore what if the growth is at 3 units per acre versus 6 units per acre. What is that savings in water use and infrastructure? So I'll share that link.
Okay.
Thanks.
Just maybe, I'll just use no math and just say, let's be intuitive for a moment. If you got a 100-acre parcel and you're putting roads throughout the whole thing, and you take all of that potential density on that parcel and push it down to 25 acres, shorter roads, shorter pipes, all of that. Less infrastructure you have to put in for the same number of units. Now, maybe the units won't be worth the same amount, but they could be close these days. So.
Thank you. So this is a follow-up part of that question too. Also, would a developer save enough in impact fees using a cluster TDR development to support the creation of some affordable housing units?
Why don't you take that, Sean?
Yeah, it's interesting. I hadn't really seen this until talking with Arthur C. Nelson a little bit over the last couple of weeks. We're going to redo this presentation down in St. George, beginning of April 5th and 6th, I think. And anyway, we were talking about TDR a little bit, and there are some communities that have done TDR for affordable housing, okay? So if you can bring credits and turn those into affordable housing credits, actual development, you get some additional density and bonuses, I guess, again. So just an interesting idea. I hadn't seen that applied. We may explore that a little bit more in St. George. But affordable housing, you know, that's not a separate issue, but it's a part of the picture that we need to all be thinking about. The mayor mentioned attainable housing. It's another nice name for affordable or workforce, whatever you want to call it. All of the housing that we're seeing built these days is really not affordable to most folks, okay? Very difficult to make that work if you're washing dishes someplace, right? Could TDR be used to assure some of that? Seems like it, but that would be a deed restriction and probably a little bit beyond my expertise at the moment. Just say that's an interesting idea though. Okay, all set for chat questions for a minute? I think we're gonna move on to this guy who's down in Kanab somewhere, I don't know.
Yeah, I think John snapped that picture. We were on a hike at the last APA conference, but I used to work in Kanab. That was my the first municipal planning position I had, so I was pretty riveted by the view. 6 years earlier, working in that community and just seeing the view of Kanab there. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the experience in Nibley with TDR. We've been studying, developing, considering TDR for a solid year now. TDR was identified as a strategy in our open space master plan. It's been something the city has looked at as a potential strategy to preserve open space, preserve our rural heritage. Nibley City is a rapidly growing community, as much of the valley is here in Cache Valley and throughout the state. Went just within a few decades from a small kind of rural farming community to more of a bedroom suburban community that with many more residents than what the old timers are used to there, and even for those that, the new residents, one of the things that gravitated them to Nibley was kind of the small town feel, the rural heritage, the big open spaces. And so TDR's looked at it as a way to, with some trade-offs, to potentially preserve those open spaces. So we can advance the slide. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the process that we went through to look to develop a potential TDR program, which hasn't been adopted yet. I'll go over that. May not be adopted, but we have gone through an extensive process in considering this. And we, with the help of a consultant team, and John Jansen was at the helm of that, leading that consultant team. The process that we went through included extensive public engagement. So we engaged not just with residents, but landowners and farmers, developers, to try to understand, where people would like to preserve, if it makes sense, preserve open spaces or recreational areas, if it would make sense and pencil on the developer side, would it be worth it on a landowner's side. So a lot of engagement there, different methods we used. The case studies, John mentioned those also informed the development of the TDR ordinance, and and all those were in Utah. I won't go over them again. John already mentioned some of those different examples. And then we had Zion's Public Finance on the consultant team who looked at the market and kind of what the tipping point would be for a developer for it to pencil. So how many credits, for example, per acre would need to transfer for it to be worth it on the developer's side, and if that would be worth it for the property owners. So that there was some analysis there. Now that said, as we know, the market is ever changing, and at the end of the day, it does take a voluntary transaction. It's all market based, but we at least wanted to have it grounded in some sense, so that if adopted, it would be feasible for that transaction to take place. And then, with the help of the consultant, we looked at the sending and receiving areas based on what we heard from the community, and also the city's plans, what was in our general plan, our open space plan. And these areas were refined significantly through the process. There's a lot of different values that were expressed that changed the map as it went through that process. I'll go into a little bit more on the lessons learned, but there wasn't really a lot of consensus on what we wanted, exactly where and exactly what we wanted to preserve. Just a lot of different attributes of things that the community expressed, that we're chasing after there. And then lastly, drafting the ordinance that's catered to the community and blends with the framework of our ordinance. So we did take a lot of time considering, well, if you can already do one thing in one part of the ordinance, why would you even consider doing utilizing TDR? So for example, we have a cluster subdivision option. So we looked at, okay, what are the trade-offs? Why would anyone go through the hassle of approaching a property owner and transferring TDR credits if they have a more viable option through a cluster subdivision? So we looked at it that way and kind of those trade-offs. So the original ordinance was presented in October, and we've since October, with the Planning Commission, with the City Council, refined the ordinance, considered the ordinance. The Planning Commission ultimately recommended not to approve the TDR ordinance. It's currently being considered by the City Council, and we might know the fate of it tomorrow night when the City Council considers it at their meeting, and see where it heads from there. Or they might continue it again and consider there's a lot to consider with the TDR ordinance. I'll get a little bit into the lessons learned. If you can advance the slide, Tim. So just some things to consider if you're looking at potentially developing a TDR ordinance. Based on our experience going through the process, there does need to be some general support to preserve something in your community, and this includes a trade-off of potentially adding additional density somewhere else above and beyond what you might currently allow in your ordinance, and whether it's density or other concessions, other things that you're going to allow that you wouldn't normally allow in your ordinance. This is something I think that we've struggled with through the process in Nibley, because there's a lot of different things that we'd like to preserve. And if you ask one person, maybe it's the views they want to preserve. If you ask another, we want to have more trail and recreation opportunities, and then another person might say that it's the farmland, it's the agricultural heritage that we're trying to preserve. We found it's difficult at the end of the day to try to try to accomplish all of that with one tool with TDR, and so trying to nail that down early in the process, I think could be helpful. And just similarly, the sending and receiving areas, it really should be defined early so everyone can kind of get on the same page on which areas we're okay with more density, which areas would we like to preserve. We continue to refine that map, and there's a lot of, as I mentioned, there's a lot of different opinions on which areas are worth preserving, which areas make the most sense to have additional development. So not only looking at the attributes of those areas, I think that's a good thing to start from, but to nail down the map, because once people see colors on a map, that's when they really start to get emotional, whether it's their own property, or it's their neighbor's property. That's something that I think could be helpful to tease out early in the process. And then also just, defining the scope of the TDR program. What is it you're trying to accomplish with that? That would be something that would be helpful to define early in the process, and potentially focus, right? That's kind of where I've got that image there. What exactly are we trying to preserve? What exactly are we trying to accomplish here? This one, TDR, it's complicated. It takes some time for everyone to get an understanding of what it is, what it isn't. So communication, looking at comprehensively, not just with the decision maker, with the planning commission, the city council, making sure they understand it, but the general public, make sure that there's some effective ways to communicate what TDR is, how it might affect them, whether they're a property owner, whether they're a resident within the community. That's something that could be helpful. We did have, a video presentation. We had a website to help people. I've had several, once it started to become more real, going through the process of considering this, and we started to have public hearings on this, I had several, 15 to 30-minute conversations with residents and property owners that were concerned. The reality is you can't do that with everyone. There's not enough hours in the day, but usually through that conversation we had, we were able to resolve a lot of concerns. There may be ways to improve that communication across that broad audience. And then, this last point of the voluntary nature of TDR, we tried to really drive that home through the presentation, but I feel like that becomes a reoccurring concern with everyone involved, with especially with property owners, with developers, that they don't have to use this as a tool. It is voluntary. So just to effectively kind of harp on that, on that part of what a TDR program is. I think that's all I've got. So.
Ben, Levi, a question?
Yep. Words of wisdom. There we go.
Can you tell us what were the major objections of your planning commission, why they voted against this?
That's great. I won't call on any specific planning commissioners today, but no, I mean, I think in general, there is a lot of unknowns of what's going to happen, when you pass something like this that could have far-reaching effects across the community. The Nibley City already has some ordinances in place that aim to preserve open space. As I mentioned, we have, a clustered subdivision. We have another, it's called an open space subdivision, where we allow a density bonus. And one of the concerns was, well, we want to promote that development as opposed, or that development type as opposed to a TDR, because the open space is benefiting those in close proximity, where the TDR may be, on the fringe of the development. So, I mean, in general, I think there's a lot of, I think they wanted more assurance on what the outcomes would be on TDR. It's one of those things that unless it gets adopted, we don't necessarily know that, but we tried to, in our recommendation, put constraints in place where, we might be comfortable with, for example, what the maximum density might be. But I think at the end of the day, that's what it came down to, is those unknowns, and the fact that, well, maybe we should focus and promote these other open space preservation tools that we have rather than a TDR.
Another question?
Thanks, Levi. It's an interesting set of parameters that you have to deal with there. So one of the things that I think would have been helpful to me that maybe you have available on the website is the actual maps that you have developed. As a former commissioner, a question I would have is, it sounds like, when you talk about it, like market-based planning. You can have two people, they decide to make a trade, everything's great, except for the planning commission then doesn't feel like they have any control over where things are being developed, or whether somebody's going to put something in the way of an annexation or some other unknown thing that's going to happen. And that's what planners hate, is, and because they hear from residents all the time that because of changes that are made along the way, there's not an understanding of what a developer can or may not be able to do later. So are those? Is that something that, and I'd like to hear that too from the county, is that something that you're looking at specifically? Are there specific areas within which you would have senders and specific other places where you'd have receivers?
You want to talk about your map?
Yeah, okay.
Yeah, so we did define and have defined sending and receiving areas, and as I mentioned, it changed through the process. I probably should have put the actual maps in the slide here. Originally, it was very extensive and included. We really tried to include anything and everything that we heard that the community valued as far as receiving areas, and then sending areas were kind of either areas where we had already decided as a community that we were comfortable with additional density, or areas where there's support of infrastructure along transportation corridors, and then that was kind of pared down to not as much focus, for example, on agricultural preservation, which that covered a very large area, but on preserving scenic vistas and preserving areas that may have potential hazards, natural hazards associated with them. Not sure if I'm fully answering the question, but John, maybe if you want to add to that.
Anything? You don't have a map yet.
Oh, to be determined.
Yeah. Okay. That's a good answer. To be determined. Let me just maybe touch on that for a minute, because it comes back to a couple of principles, at least in my mind. Your general plan ought to have suggestions somewhere that this is where we're going to concentrate our town center, or this is where we're going to have a little commercial node, or this is Main Street. We're going to put something next to Main Street to support it. So the plan itself ought to have some influence on those receiving areas. Did I say the receiving areas is the biggest issue? I think I did, yeah. I'm going to just throw another perspective. Isn't this good planning to think about where the more easily developed, the better developed areas should be versus the areas that shouldn't be? It's almost like good planning. Wow. Anyway, sorry. I probably have a biased perspective. But let me throw one more thing at you. We did a Heritage Days booth in Nibley. We had little stickers, okay? A poster for a sending area, a poster for a receiving area. We had no trouble getting people to put those stickers on the sending areas. We had a lot of trouble getting people to move over and actually put something on a receiving area. But we forced them to do that. So, the map kind of flowed out of all that. So I think the mapping is a really important step, okay? And it was on the webpage, still there, that kind of thing. Okay, so another question.
I appreciate learning more about what's going on here, but I have questions about at what point did the public get involved in this decision-making process? And at what point do they no longer have any input? And also, same with the Planning Commission or the City Council, because it sounds like once we make our decision, we're doing this, then if a developer gets credits, then it's happening. And there are no more discussions from the public or from the Planning Commission or the City Council. Is that true? And when does that line of communication or voting or input stop? When does that change over to where there's no more decision?
Well, part of that depends on how well you want it to work, okay? The state legislature, just going to toss this in, they've really been encouraging us to get our communication, get our input while we're developing ordinances, and not so much once they're in place, okay? Conditional use theory, okay? 20 years ago, you could deny a conditional use just because you didn't want a 7-Eleven over there, okay? Today, that's not the case, right? If it's allowed in the zone, you shall approve it. You can mitigate any, what's the right term? Something or other impact.
Reasonably anticipated detrimental effect.
Thank you. There is an attorney in the room. Anyhow, yeah, you can do that, but what does that really mean? It's some minor mitigation, and you have to allow it, okay? So, in this case, developing the ordinance is when you want that input. You want as much as you can do. I mean, we took 6 months, okay, to get through that, and maybe never get through it. But nevertheless, that's when that input happens. If you want it to be really effective, it's more of a site planning process once they get those credits and bring them to that receiving area, okay? If you're wanting to say no at that point, there's a problem, okay? That developer's not going to engage in that process if he's not going to have some guarantees. Does that make sense?
It sort of does, but if a decision's made, I mean, we recently had a situation where a decision was made, zoning was set up, and then there's a referendum that said, no, we don't want to do that. 80% of the people voted no, and overturned that, and I would assume that that's not an option in a case like this. Is that true? Citizens don't have an option to have a referendum and say.
So a referendum on the ordinance adoption would be a possibility. Once it was in place for a while, I'd say no, but maybe Craig will agree or disagree. He agrees, okay. So, while that ordinance is going through that process and you've adopted it, somebody wants to do a referendum on it, yes. But once it's been established for months, years, whatever it might be, then the ordinance prevails at that point, okay? And, you know, and I know that may bother you, but as I said, well, the real point is that because of a lot of the state laws that have changed, all of that kind of stuff has changed too, okay? So, I forget, are we doing a referendum one sometime? Yes, we are. And not me as a we, but you as a we, so there we go. Okay, other questions? Larry?
John, I never want to argue with you, you know that, right? But let me offer a surprising and somewhat ironic point of view from watching this process in Nibley. And as Levi mentioned, it's still going on in front of our city council. We reached out on more public notification through the planning commission process than anything we've ever done before in Nibley for the last 25 years, by at least a factor of 10. And that's because when the planning commission was refining the map, putting green on sending areas and red on receiving areas, that pretty much included everyone in Nibley City that would be noticed that there was a public hearing to hear about this proposed ordinance. Not only that, we also identified areas outside of Nibley City that were currently in the unincorporated part of the county that were within our annexation plan. And in that annexation plan, we said we would also entertain the thought of making those areas as sending areas to preserve those through this TDR process. So that meant we sent oodles and oodles and oodles of letters to people not only within Nibley, but also people outside of Nibley. And that was a little bit hard for some people to understand why Nibley City, when they weren't even in Nibley City, was sending them a notice of a public hearing, and lo and behold, there's a green dot on my property. And we all have a healthy mistrust for government, maybe more so than in Nibley than other places, I'm not sure. But that got people very interested in this process. And of course, we would try to explain that, number one, it would be a voluntary effort unless they got drug in by a whole bunch of other landowners. It would be a voluntary decision on their part to, number one, annex into Nibley, and then number two, decide to become a sending area once they had annexed. So despite what Tim talked about with an interlocal agreement, we have at least limited the draft ordinance in Nibley to sending areas must be in Nibley and receiving areas must be in Nibley. So that definitely got a lot of people's attention. And the thing that was surprising to me, John, was I spoke to many, many, many more people, and we heard many, many, many more comments in the two huge public hearings that the Planning Commission held from people in sending areas not liking the idea, instead of people that were located next to a receiving area. And it's probably about 50-1 in terms of public comment. And there was one guy that said, wait a minute, I don't want to be next to that receiving area. And everyone else that talked to me was saying, I don't want to be a sending area. And it's a completely voluntary process. And so now our city council is trying to wrestle with the idea, if it's voluntary and if they tell us they don't want to be a sending area, should we just take the green dot off the map now, or should we leave it on and leave it as a possibility for them if they change their mind? But I heard way more, Levi, nod your head yes, way more people from sending areas not wanting to be a part of it than from living next to a receiving area. And maybe we didn't message it right, I'm not sure, but that was a surprise to me.
Yeah. Yeah, I think the communication on that part is tough, yes. But I can understand that. Down in Spanish Fork, where they're trying to do this preserving the river bottoms area. Yep, Wendy's still coming up. You didn't want me to read your sign, I know. But in Spanish Fork, it just was clear that folks didn't understand the voluntary nature. Even if you have the dot, doesn't mean you have to participate, right? So anyway, but I think that's interesting that it was a tougher piece of this. So we have a question on that side and a question from chat. Okay. And how are we doing on time?
So this comment in the chat is the threshold for referenda is about to change with a bill in the legislature that would eliminate them when a land use regulation receives a 2/3 vote from the legislative body, city council, and planning commission. And I should add that that's SB 199 and it passed the Senate and it's in the House Rules Committee.
Referendums. It's another topic for another day, but I think that's a big one. It's an interesting thing. Legislature's getting much more involved than they used to.
Can you talk a little bit about how you work out the long-term funding of a conservation easement if you establish one, especially for, say, like a recreational area?
So would it be okay if I just said that's a great segue for Wendy? Let's skip my slide, then we'll come back to that. And, okay, sorry.
Question before we move on.
Yeah.
So, sorry, can you help me out? Thanks. I'm wondering if there has ever been when a sending area sells a TDR to a receiving area, if there's ever been an exaction on the sending area so if you have like a requirement in your general plan and they're losing the opportunity to develop on that property, but say in the general plan there's a trail that goes through that sending area. If at the time of sale of those TDRs that the developer that's receiving the TDRs can be required to construct that trail on the sending area based on a requirement in the general plan.
Well, I've not seen that, but doesn't mean you couldn't do it. I think you could also provide some extra credits for doing the trail that could be kind of earmarked for that recreation purpose. But there's a lot of nuances you could throw in, but how much you want to do is another question. So that's a good one. All right, I would like to push over to Wendy. Wendy, are you there? How does this work for her? She has to share.
I'm the executive director of Utah Open Lands. I've been with Utah Open Lands for 32 years. I've seen a lot of different development scenarios as we talk about how we plan for our communities. And I think that coming back to the way that this started, the bottom line is, if you win, it's awesome. But if you lose the ability to produce local food that you send back on refrigerated trucks for food that we bring into the state, our food costs go up at least 10%. If you lose clean air to breathe, if you lose clean water, and if you lose some of the recreational amenities that bring people to the community in the first place, there are consequences. And I think that's one of the reasons that we talk so much about making sure that the planning we do is really at the end of the day mindful. And I think that there were a couple of things that were brought up that I'd kind of like to highlight before I start into the main presentation. One of the things I think is really interesting about that whole idea of, are we tired of winning? Believe it or not, 80% of the folks that started Utah Open Lands were real estate agents and developers, because they recognized that if we lost the very reason that people were coming and enjoying the community, moving into the community, then indeed we will have killed the goose that laid the golden egg. And usually I ask this question, but I'll just give you the answer anyway. For the past 32 years, at least that I've been working in the state of Utah, the top 2 reasons that people come to the state of Utah to visit, they move here or they stay here, are its scenic beauty and recreational opportunity. And you better believe that those farm fields are part of that scenic beauty. We certainly saw during COVID that if you can work remotely, you can live wherever you want to a certain extent. And I think that did definitely drive a lot of even market values in various different communities. And I think the final thing that I would say is that at the end of the day, one of the reasons that protecting values like open space, agricultural farm fields, recreational opportunities, and really looking at some of these tools, whether it's a TDR or a cluster or a density bonus situation or a conservation easement, which I'm going to talk about, is because actually open space preservation makes economic sense. In 2008, we saw that communities that had open space retained their market value when other communities did not. During COVID, Utah's economy grew by 3%, where a lot of other communities' economies didn't, because you could go outside and stay 6 feet apart. And then, of course, there's a statistic that the Utah State University has come out with, and we saw it actually when we were working on the open space bond in Wasatch County. And that is, for every dollar in residential development tax revenue, it actually costs a community between $1.19 and $1.65. So yes, we want to recognize that developers are there. They're going to look at the profits they can make. But as a community, we take on the costs of infrastructure. We take on the costs of the police and the sewer and the maintenance that Tim was talking about once that infrastructure has been put in place. Conversely, for every dollar in revenue that's generated, even off of agricultural greenbelt properties, it only costs a community about 65 cents. And that's even without counting the ancillary benefits that you get from protecting open space and a place that people want to come and enjoy and visit. And the reason for that, obviously, is you're not out there calling the police to corral the cows, right? There's a lot less services that are needed for that agricultural land and for those open spaces. So when I talk about a land trust, for some, I'm the anti-hero, and for some, I'm the hero. So it'll depend on you as to which I am. But we've talked a lot about, and we talk a lot about in the state of Utah, but even throughout the nation, the idea of private property rights. And really, most of our planning departments, most of the work that we do in communities is to allow landowners to exercise their private property right to develop their land. What a land trust does is we help landowners who want to exercise their private property right to preserve their land. And for doing so, there are all sorts of tax benefits that can be accrued. And there's also even the potential of purchasing part or all of the value of the conservation easement. And I'll get into how that works. But I think one of the things that's really important to understand is that aside from a land trust being a 501c3 nonprofit public charity, we also are an entity that is eligible to hold conservation easements under 170H of the federal tax code. And in order for us to be eligible, there are a number of things that we have to meet that are actually come from that code. And it goes to the question that the gentleman asked with respect to the potential cost of maintaining the conservation easement. And I want to talk about two different costs there. One being that we have to have the resources and the commitment to defend the conservation terms. And in order to do that, land trusts always look to have a stewardship fund. And that can vary based on what it is that you're going to have to do in terms of enforcing that conservation easement. Everything from how many reserved rights are there to what are the adjacent landowners going to do that are going to create third-party violations. And I will get into that later. But in addressing that specific question, there's another part of it that isn't just the costs that come from doing the conservation easement, holding the conservation easement into perpetuity, but it also is a cost that gets back to something that I think people talked about with respect to farmers. One of the things that we don't often recognize is what an amazing steward our farmers and ranchers are of our landscapes. They maintain those properties, and it is not a cost to the community. But when you have a sending or a receiving zone, and especially the sending areas, and you've placed a conservation easement on it, and if there are trails for the community, there is long-term costs associated with maintaining those trails, spraying for noxious weeds, all of those sorts of things. So where the landowner, if they continue to own the land, because essentially they continue to do what they want to on the property, the maintenance of the land is borne by the landowner, but there's still a stewardship cost associated with basically the administration of the conservation easement by the land trust. But I would like to say that the other element of land trust, before we advance to the next slide, is that aside from defending these conservation easements, and I can tell you some great war stories, we also become a steward of the community land and the community resources that are a part of that landscape. And I think what's been brought up today, but I will say it a different way. Oftentimes when we look at how we grow our communities, we think first and foremost about where the roads are going to go, what traffic congestion is going to look like. Maybe we even think about where our commercial centers are going to be. But I would challenge folks, if they really want to preserve the quality of life that they appreciate here in the state of Utah and in their communities, that they really think about what it is that they want to save and how they're really going to be able to accomplish that. And I'll tell you a story about the Kohler Dairy in a moment, and that will help illustrate a little bit about really thinking about what it is you want to save and what exactly is it going to take, because it's not going to just be a conservation easement or a certain amount of money or even just a TDR. It's really a commitment to that value and that resource that sets your community apart. Because the last thing that we really did learn about COVID, and we've seen it repeated over and over and over again, is that they don't want to move to any town USA. They want to move to a place that has resonance. They want to move to a community that calls to them. And as the public affairs director for Park City used to say, nobody wants to leave the suburbs of the LA basin to come and recreate in the suburbs of the mountains. And so that was part of their ideal in terms of what they wanted to protect in designing the sustainability of the economy of their community. So let's go to the next slide. So I think it's important to just get a sense of conservation easements and what they are. And part of it is that a conservation easement is basically an interest in property. And basically until 1985, here in the state of Utah, until we got the conservation easement enabling legislation, we didn't really have the ability to do conservation easements in the same way that it's intended under 170H of the code. And in order to do a conservation easement that you can get a tax deduction for, or that foundations are going to participate in, or that you can do a bargain sale, or that some of these federal programs, which I'm going to talk about later, to get those involved, you have to make sure that you're meeting both the 170H requirements and also working through the enabling legislation from the conservation easement statute. But I think one of the things that you all are probably thinking about, and we know from all sorts of time spent on the land, is that without funding, it becomes increasingly hard to protect lands through a conservation easement, or just to protect lands in general. And a lot of that is because the tax incentive that you can get from that conservation easement, which again is just an interest in the property. We don't own all of the property, and I'll help explain that in a minute. But what was really fortunate for us is in 1999, the legislature started the Utah Critical Lands Task Force, which then in 2000 became the Leroy McAllister Critical Lands Fund. Right now, there's a bill going through the legislature. I believe Representative Casey Snyder has been working on it. And it's really changing the title to kind of a working lands critical fund, so that monies that could be put in there could be spent towards the protection of agricultural and working landscapes. That fund has not been funded in the past couple of years to any substantial amount of money. And that makes it really hard for us to take advantage of some of these federal programs and even of private fundraising when we want to go ahead and protect a piece of property under a conservation easement. So actually, open space bonds that are run by various different communities are one of the ways that we can help to leverage additional funds. So one of the first community open space bonds took place in Park City, and that was in 2000. But there have been open space bonds throughout various different communities. And in fact, many of you are aware that Cache County recently passed an open space bond. I will tell you the good news about that is not only does it provide a vehicle for landowners who want to exercise their private property right to preserve their land while retaining their land, and maybe, as John pointed out, the idea of being able to have some of that retirement fund actually put into cash. One of the other things about these open space bonds that we've seen over and over again is that actually they can be leveraged to a great extent. In some instances, every dollar of bond money from your community can be leveraged 2 to 3 to even 10 times over, stretching those tax dollars and stretching those bond dollars to be able to help more landowners who are interested in protecting their landscapes. And let's go to the next slide as we talk about the fact that the community open space bonds really do create this leveraging for placing a conservation easement on the property. So when you hear about conservation easements, you might hear the term like, oh, well, I did an agricultural easement, or I did a scenic easement, or I did a natural wildlife habitat easement. Basically, those are the conservation purposes that are established both under Utah code and under the federal code that really help us place a conservation easement. And we are basically protecting those conservation purposes by drafting a document that wraps a big bow around the development rights and enables Utah Open Lands to enforce against development on the property in order to preserve the conservation resources like agriculture or forest lands, or what we call clearly delineated government policies, wildlife habitat, and recreation and education values, as well as places that are either under the Register of Historic Places or, for example, on the East Coast, they've even used it to protect battlefields. Now, I want to make one thing clear. First and foremost, as a landowner, if you wanted to do a conservation easement, you don't have to qualify for all of the conservation purposes. You just have to qualify for one. So you don't have to open your land up to public recreation, for example. You can, but you may just qualify under the scenic value. In other words, looking across your agricultural farm field is something that is a beauty to behold. And that is as recognized as a conservation purpose. In addition to that, and this is where there's a great nexus between the community open space bonds and open space funding and the different federal and private funds that are available out there. So some of you may be familiar with the Natural Resource Conservation Service. There are a number of programs like the Farmland Protection Program, the Wetland Protection Program. Even down in the Salt Lake Valley around Camp Williams, there's the Army Compatible Use Buffer area. All of those are considered these clearly delineated government conservation policies because they're conserving land as open space for a clearly delineated government policy. And you strengthen that when you add an open space bond, because you're saying we're going to put money towards this particular piece of property, and we feel that this is valuable enough for us to expend resources as a community. But what can happen is you can actually purchase the value of the conservation easement through both the bond funds and through basically these federal programs. So let's just talk a little bit about how that works, for example, with the NRCS ALE, the ACEP program, basically. It's their agricultural conservation easement program or their agricultural land easement program. And basically, coming back to that concept of the conservation easement and the purchase of the conservation easement, what basically these programs will do is they'll provide up to, in some instances, 75% of the value of the conservation easement. Sometimes it's only 50% of the value of the conservation easement. But then in that particular instance, the community can come in with 25% of the value of the conservation easement. And because of the tax incentives, which are available through the code, through the federal government, oftentimes landowners are asked to bring in another 25%, not in cash, but in actual land value. And the thing that can be really valuable about that is basically, if you're a qualifying agricultural landowner, the conservation easement tax deduction incentive for you is 100% of your adjusted gross income against the value of the gift for up to 16 years, or when that gift is used up. If you're not a qualifying farmer or rancher, you can receive up to 50% of your adjusted gross income against the value of the gift as a tax deduction for the 16 years. And what I like to tell landowners is, one, private foundations really like to see that landowners have skin in the game when it comes to putting money into purchasing a conservation easement. So they like to see what we call bargain sale conservation easements. But then the other part of it that I think is really valuable is, if I'm going to engage in a fundraising campaign, it lessens the amount of money that basically the landowner is going to receive and might have to just turn around and pay in taxes. And I'd rather keep the money in the community. So if we go to the next slide, I'll talk a little bit about how we work with landowners and also how you get to this valuation nugget of the conservation easement, because I think that's important. Oh, I think it may have gone past one. So with conservation easements, I'm going to touch on some of the questions, and I want to talk a little bit about the Kohler Dairy, because I think it will help you understand how we start looking at conservation easements in various different situations. So working with the landowner is probably the traditional role that a conservation easement usually has, or a land trust usually has, in doing a conservation easement. And if you think about the value of your land as being the full fair market value is like a whole pie. Well, if Utah Open Lands comes in and takes several slices of that pie that are the development value, we're not taking the whole pie. So we're not going to pay you the full fair market value. We're just going to pay you the value of those slices that we've taken. You may reserve certain slices. You might even reserve a slice that allows you to build another home on your property, for example. But every slice that you reserve takes away from the slices that we're actually purchasing. And in fact, one of the things that we often have to look at when we're doing conservation easements and we're looking at these valuations is that one slice of that really good pie that is left, that has the development right left on it, actually increases in value by the mere fact that we have purchased those other development values. Oftentimes people talk about it in terms of purchasing the development rights. I don't always like to talk about that concept because there's a lot more nuance to it. And the other issue is that we can't participate, nor can you get funding from any of these federal programs that I mentioned, unless you get a qualified conservation easement appraisal. And that is not the same as a fair market value appraisal, because basically what you're doing is you're looking at the fair market value of the property before you have put any encumbrances or restrictions. And then you're looking at the fair market value of the property once you've put all those restrictions on it. And it's the difference between those two values that become the value of the conservation easement. As I mentioned, you can receive a tax deduction. That's the generous deduction that's available through the federal tax system. There are some states, not Utah, but there are some states where you can actually also get a tax credit from your state income. But in addition to that, by being able to use the conservation easement appraisal and go and apply for some of these different federal programs, we actually have a value that we're looking at, that before you go into the process, basically, you know what you're going to end up with at the end of the day. And, you know, even though I know for a lot of landowners, their land is their kind of retirement, I think that the thing that we've looked at with landowner after landowner is so many of them will say, even if we had all of this money, we would want to live in this place that is basically the landscape that we're currently on. And so this gives a way for a landowner to continue to be on the land. It saves the community money in terms of maintenance. But then in addition to that, it also is a way, I think, to provide a little bit of that retirement value back. Now, it is in perpetuity in order to qualify. So that means it has to be done forever. There can't be any term limited easements. And yes, you are making a decision about the future of this landscape. But when we look at what we've lost around the state of Utah, and I grew up in Utah County, and the orchards that I used to ride my horse through are no longer there. And when you look at the loss of those landscapes, I think what we really need to look at again in our communities is, what is the legacy that we want to leave for the next generation? So beyond working with landowners, Utah Open Lands oftentimes will work with various different communities, whether it's working to help them with their bond process and when they go forward and doing the conservation easement. We also work with HOAs. So oftentimes a developer will come in, maybe able to do the cluster incentive or that bonus density to create open space over here. Well, what guarantees that that open space is going to stay there forever? I can tell you there are a couple of court cases where 10 years later, another developer comes in and wants to develop the open space that was used to get the original bonus densities. And if there's nothing on that property restricting it, oftentimes it's hard to be able to change that. In fact, I know of one community where essentially the homeowners association failed to pay property taxes, and the open space ended up being sold at a sheriff's sale. And it was purchased by a developer who then came in and is now wanting to develop the property. So oftentimes we'll work with HOAs to place a conservation easement on the property, or even with developers. I will tell you that oftentimes that can be a real struggle from a stewardship perspective, because people don't always treat the open space with the same kind of respect that they would treat their backyard. Sometimes they create social trails, really kind of privatizing the open space if it's used for community. So there are a lot of headaches involved in that, but there are also some really great success stories of working with HOAs. And then there are successive lot owners that end up being grantors, or successive landowners. And one thing that's been tough, and this is what we talk about with landowners, is really the function that Utah Open Lands oftentimes serves in working with various different landowners, is one of the reasons we really try to make a tight conservation easement is we're not worried about that first landowner. We're worried about the eventuality of that landowner going away. And if it gets sold to somebody who wants to try and break the conservation easement, or somebody who isn't as passionate about the landscape, that's where we can find some stewardship issues. I touched on the open space maintenance issue, so let's go to the next slide. So that brings us, as we talk about these different entities that might end up with the eventual ownership of these open spaces that we create, we come to TDRs and conservation easements. And I think one of the questions is, why would a land trust not accept land that is created by a TDR? And one of the reasons that we might not accept land that under a conservation easement that's been created by a TDR is because it doesn't really pass the conservation purposes test. And if we hold a conservation easement on a piece of property that we really can't defend long-term because it doesn't pass the conservation purpose test, then we're going to have a problem. And so that's one of the reasons that land trusts are not interested in doing it. Another could be sort of a headache from some of the stewardship responsibilities. But again, coming back to what a lot of people have said in this session today already, one of the things that's really, really key is really focusing on what it is you want to save. And what is the sustainability? What is that going to mean to your economy? What is that going to mean to your community long term? Because if it is really valuable and it's a really treasured landscape and value that you have, chances are a land trust would be willing to hold a conservation easement on it. So again, that's where oftentimes, obviously, with TDRs and land trusts, we can participate with a community as they work through this process. But I want to make one thing very, very clear. You don't get a second bite at the apple. You don't get to double dip. When you've done that TDR transfer, you received value by sending it someplace else. And so you can't get a tax deduction. You can't then sell the conservation easement in a bargain sale situation. There are other ways to protect land that has been basically protected through TDR. There are various different deed restrictions. I actually live in a community here where there is a restrictive covenant on the trails. And because each one of the property owners has a portion of the trail on their property, they are considered anchor parcels, and they have the right to enforce the restrictive covenants. And actually, we just did that and we're successful. It is tough. And it is something that you really want to think about if you really want to ensure that basically the value that you as a community have given to a developer or a landowner in giving them this additional density in the receiving area, that you really have found a good mechanism to protect that sending area and the value that, you know, led you down to the TDR place in the first place. And so that's, I think the question comes down to, can TDRs create long-term community benefit without a deed restriction? And I would caution that, because I think that without a deed restriction, 10, 20 years, I can tell you after 32 years of doing it, enforcing these conservation easements is incredibly tough. I can't imagine what it would be like to have a piece of property that was done through a process and is supposed to be protected, but it doesn't have a conservation easement on it. It doesn't have any sort of deed restriction. In fact, I have watched land that was legislatively protected 10 years later be overturned so that it could be developed. I even have witnessed in a county that will remain nameless, actually trading out land for development that they purchased with open space bond funds because it didn't have a conservation easement on it. So you really want to think through those tools and techniques. And oftentimes, I think has been said before by other speakers, it's actually having a toolbox. You might need a wrench, you might need a hammer, you might need a screwdriver, but you ought to think about the fact that not one tool is going to get the job completely done. Next slide. So, why a land trust? And I think that one of the reasons that I would say why a land trust is not only are we ensuring the community promise, because this is all we do. We don't have to worry about being beholden to anything other than the promise we made in protecting that landscape. And we're a third party to oversee these properties. But I think there's another element, and for that, I'll just touch on the story of the Kohler family up in the Midway area. The Midway community and also Wasatch County both independently passed open space bonds. And they knew desperately that they wanted to protect the scenic character coming into their community. But one of the things that I think was really tough is this element that most of the land they wanted to see protected was agricultural land. And you can't guarantee that the next generation is going to want to move a bunch of hand lines. You can't guarantee that the hard, long hours, especially in a dairy, is going to be there for the next generation. But what we found was even more critical, because the Kohlers were very committed to seeing their land protected, and the next generation, and even the next generation, is there an agricultural economy to sustain having agricultural landscapes protected in the community? And so when we talk about size, which I know somebody mentioned before, how small is too small to be able to protect an agricultural landscape? I would really encourage you, and this is one of the things that land trusts do, is they really think through our promises forever. So I want to make sure that there is an agricultural economy to sustain this. And one of the things we talked about with the community is that by preserving the Kohler dairy, we were actually creating what I like to call the anchor tenant, right? When you think about a strip mall, the anchor tenant is what you go after in order to make sure that the strip mall is going to pencil out. Because if you have the Wendy's or the whatever people like to go shop at, I don't know, the Macy's, whatever, you are going to be ensuring that the other businesses that come along into that strip mall have a feeder. They have businesses that are coming in. Well, similarly, by knowing that we had a solid agricultural operation that had its own cheese shop, and that was a tourist destination in and of itself, you were always going to have somebody with the big machineries and tools needed to hay fields and plow fields and all of those sorts of things to be able to, in some instances, lease agricultural land. So in fact, there was a landowner that we worked with. They ended up donating some land to the city. A big portion of that land is agricultural hay and grazing property. And the Kohlers are looking at a potential lease on that property. Now, obviously, the city goes through an RFP process and, make sure that they're not picking favorites. But the point is, we know from the outset that we have a solid agricultural business that we can add to. And that's what I would encourage with folks when they're looking at protecting agriculture in their community. Do you have a nucleus or a nexus? And in fact, that's why a lot of people look at these agricultural protection areas that are afforded through the Utah Code as a gateway to figuring out what agricultural areas they want to eventually place under a conservation easement, because those agricultural protection areas set aside a certain amount of acreage with committed landowners. So it doesn't have to be just one landowner. And you start to see whether or not, okay, this is a consolidated group of farmers that if we can keep them farming, we've got a good anchor tenant, if you will, in our community for agricultural land. The other element is obviously we think through, well, what happens if the agriculture can't continue to sustain itself? We hope that doesn't happen because, again, we all need to eat. So we think there will always be farmers. There will have to always be farmers. But in addition to that, just because we lose some of the agricultural use and utility of that land for a little while doesn't necessarily mean that the other conservation values have gone away. And in fact, we protected one of the first agricultural properties down in the Draper area. That landowner passed away, and for about 10 years, there wasn't a lot of agricultural activity. There's a few leases now and again. Well, today it is the home to a number of different community-supported agricultural ventures, from community gardens to the International Rescue Committee is farming on there. And we've had organic farmers, we've had small farmers, we've had potato farmers, we've had a bunch of folks that basically, because they can do truck gardening from there, because they can take it to farmers markets, and because, quite frankly, it is a delight for the community, it is still being farmed. So we think that there are still conservation values on these properties, even if they don't continue to have the agricultural use and utility. The conservation easement's role is really the permanent protection in these landscapes. And I can tell you that we have fought everything from condemnation to third-party violations, and we've done exceedingly well. We've won every single time. The next slide, which I hope and believe is my last one, so I can keep us on time here. I think the main thing that it's important to look at, and this is as important for a landowner as it is for an HOA, as it is for, a city. One of the reasons that it's valuable to work with an organization like a land trust and place a conservation easement on the property is our conservation easement defense, because we defend against violations by third parties. And you can see right here is a violation by a third party on a piece of property that is owned by a city that we have a conservation easement on. And we actually are forcing them to cure the violation. And there's also $250,000 in stewardship restitution that's going to happen as part of the restoration of this property. And that's something that we as a third party are able to help our cities and our communities with. We defend against swaps. When a landowner places their land under a conservation easement, they're doing so because they love their land, and we're making a promise to them that it will always be protected. So we defend against that land somehow being swapped out. We defend against people coming in and wanting to amend the conservation easement and open it up to development. There's several reasons for that. First and foremost, once we do a conservation easement, it becomes a public trust. And once it becomes that public trust, if you open it up for development, you're privately benefiting somebody. So that's kind of a no-no there. But obviously the intention of the conservation easement was to preserve the property from development, not allow for an amendment to develop it. And then finally, we defend against using the conservation easement or amendments or anything like that to cure violations. We make sure that those violations are cured by the offending parties. And we've had great success in doing that as well. In fact, as a land trust, we have conservation easement defense insurance that we carry. And I think that's the last slide, but let's go to the next one just for fun. Okay, it's not. So the bottom line, I think, comes down to what do you love? What do you want to save? That's our tagline, you know, protecting the lands we love. You can see Bear Lake. That's a piece of property that we worked with the landowners on the shores of Bear Lake. We're working with them right now on additional preservation. But it's important to understand that part of why we are winning is because we saw a 300% increase in the use of our open spaces during the pandemic. And that has not changed. And when you think of something as wonderful and beautiful as the pristine Caribbean blue of Bear Lake, you know that impaired water quality will destroy that. If you look at something like Bonanza Flat, which is up at the top of Big Cottonwood Canyon, we are seeing an increase in people coming out, even just to drive through and take pictures of the incredible fall colors. And as painful as it is sometimes in our communities when the tourists invade, the marketable economic bump that, for example, Park City and Midway City saw from people just driving to see the fall colors on this protected landscape was huge. And it really helped, especially during a time when people weren't going to restaurants. So there are multiple benefits that we can get from protecting open spaces in our communities. But I think it's really, really important that we understand what we want to save, how we want to save it, the best technique for saving it, and then understanding what the long-term trajectory of that landscape and those conservation values are going to be, so we truly can protect these places that we love. And that'll do it for me.
Hey, one quick question. Will that work?
Yes. Yep. Okay.
Just quickly, Wendy, I'm just wondering how many properties, how many conservation easements is Utah Open Lands administering right now?
So we have 64,000 acres protected, and that's 100 different conservation easements. Maybe 102 now.
That's terrific. And thank you, Wendy. We've reached our time. There were a couple little other points we want to make, but they're in the handout, and you're going to get those electronically also.
There are copies here.
Yep.
And it's available online.
Online at?
utahlands.org.
There we go. Really appreciate you all being here, and we're going to be around for questions for a little bit. Online, if you have some more chat questions, we'll make a note of those and try and answer them tomorrow. Thank you all.
Yes, thank you, and thank you online. You can good work, great panel.